I remember the moment I saw his lips twist into that dismissive smirk, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and then that low, mocking laugh that spilled out as though I'd told the world's most ridiculous joke. In a single instant, he made me feel small, and I swallowed the heavy lump in my throat so he wouldn't see me cry. How many times had I done that over the years? How many times had I forced my tears back down just to avoid the endless embarrassment of letting him know he could still hurt me? I was done with that pattern, done with that cyclical bruise on my spirit that never seemed to fully heal. He laughed when I said I wanted to start over, as though every dream, every hope, and every desperate longing for something bigger than the shell of a life I was living was nothing but a silly little whim. He looked at me across the heavy oak table in our quiet dining room, raised one brow, and let that tiny, condescending laugh slip. In that moment, I wanted to shout until my voice echoed in his ears and demanded his respect. But I didn't shout. I simply turned the ring around my finger one last time, stared at the photograph on the wall of us in happier times, and thought about how sometimes the biggest changes start in the quietest moments. I still find it ironic. For so long, I'd let him set the script of my life. Now he was going to learn how it felt to watch me rewrite it. I was 20 years old when I met him, fresh out of a heartbreak that left me feeling like I was a mess, naive, and uncertain. He was charming in that breezy way, offering me half smiles and compliments that felt genuine back then. Or maybe I was just so desperate for validation that I latched onto any sign of interest. My family had always pegged me as the emotional one, the one who wore her heart on her sleeve and cried too easily at silly things. Endings of books, sappy commercials, those birthday cards that everyone else found cheesy. I walked into relationships the same way I walked into open fields as a girl. Arms wide, eyes full of wonder. In my early 20s, that wonder turned to heartbreak more often than not, but when I met him, I was willing to try again. He was older by 6 years, self-assured, handsome, in a put-together way that made me feel like I should be grateful he was even looking my way. And I was painfully grateful, trying so hard to be good enough, trying so hard to match the image he had of a perfect partner. Maybe that was my first mistake. The wedding was modest, with my sister as maid of honor and a few close friends. He insisted we didn't need a big event. At the time, I agreed. We'd use the money for a down payment on a house, some practical plan for our future. But sometimes I remember standing in my simple white dress, longing for just a little more fanfare, a father-daughter dance, a crowd cheering, maybe something that felt more like a real celebration. My parents had both passed by then, so there was no father to walk me down the aisle, no mother to fix my veil. Still, I believed in love, believed in the possibility of building something with him that would outlast any regrets about a smaller wedding. He smiled at me as we said our vows, and there was no trace of that dismissive laughter then. He kissed me softly, and for a second, the entire world felt like it was shimmering with the magic I'd always dreamed of. It's funny how quickly that shimmer fades when real life sets in. We moved into a little house, 2 bedrooms, a rickety porch that always smelled a bit like sun-bleached wood, and a backyard that had enough space for my attempts at gardening. He liked the open concept living room where he could sprawl on the couch and watch sports. I liked the creaking floorboards that added a sense of history to the place. In the early days, I would wake up excited to make him coffee, to greet him with a soft kiss on his cheek and ask about his day at work. I imagined we were a team. In my mind, marriage was about two people supporting each other, dreaming together, and forging a path. But I realized pretty soon that we had different definitions of what marriage was supposed to be. He started working longer hours at the firm. In the beginning, it was easy to rationalize bills had to be paid, and we wanted to make sure we had enough to live comfortably. I thought my role was to keep the house nice, work part-time at the local boutique, and put dinner on the table. I envisioned it as a partnership. He saw it as a division of labor, maybe. He was the breadwinner, I was the caretaker. It's not that I minded caring for the home, but there was this unspoken understanding that my aspirations beyond it were optional, secondary. If I tried to talk about going back to school, he'd remind me of how expensive it would be, how we needed to be practical. If I mentioned wanting to start a small craft business, because I've always loved making handmade soaps and candles. He'd smile politely, telling me that was a nice hobby, but not something worth investing large chunks of money into. His dismissive tone was always subtle, always cloaked in a veneer of reason, and I was often left wondering if I was being selfish for wanting something more. We did talk about kids at some point, but it never felt like a genuine conversation. He'd shrug and say maybe in a few years, that it wasn't the right time yet. I was torn, unsure if I wanted them because it was expected or if I actually yearned for motherhood. So we tabled that discussion until it got buried under other arguments, other issues. Time drifted, I got older, and so did he, but the distance between us never closed. I remember nights lying awake, listening to him breathe, thinking how I felt more alone with him than I ever did by myself. Still, I tried. I told myself all marriages have rough patches, that love changes shape over the years, that I should be grateful for the roof over my head and the security of a life that was stable. Except it wasn't stable, at least not for my heart. He climbed the ranks at the firm, working closely with his boss, a man I'd only met in passing. His boss shook my hand at the company's holiday party one year, eyes polite, a warm smile, but I never thought twice about him. I was introduced as the wife, the supportive half, the one who dutifully stands by. That night, I watched as the boss teased my husband for being a workaholic, suggesting he lighten up, have some fun. I liked the way his boss laughed. There was a sincerity to it that reminded me of someone who truly enjoys life. I felt a pang in my chest, wishing I saw that same sincerity in my husband's laughter instead of the clipped, condescending edges I'd come to expect at home. But I shook off the feeling and went back to sipping my champagne and smiling when needed. The next day, my husband accused me of flirting with some younger associate at the party because I'd laughed at the man's joke. The argument was so ridiculous, I couldn't even muster a response. That was the day I realized how quickly our relationship was dissolving into something toxic and unrecognizable. When I turned 45, I finally blurted out the words one morning over breakfast. "I want to start over," I said, the coffee mug trembling slightly in my grip. He looked at me over the rim of his newspaper like I'd just said something obscene. I wasn't even sure what I meant by it. Maybe I just wanted to move or travel or chase some dream I'd stifled for too long. But the moment he realized I was serious, that cold laugh bubbled out of him. He tilted his head back, gave me a look that said I was out of my mind, and let out that condescending chuckle. "Start over doing what exactly?" he asked, smirking. "You think you're going to get younger? You think you're going to flip a switch and suddenly become someone else?" I felt heat rising in my cheeks. My chest tightened. For so long, I'd tried to keep peace, to avoid confrontation, but something inside me snapped that day. I wanted to scream that I wasn't trying to become someone else, that I just wanted to remember who I had been before he tried to mold me into this lesser version of myself. But my tongue felt heavy in my mouth. All I managed was, "You don't understand." And he laughed again, shaking his head as if I were a foolish child. That was the moment I decided I was done letting him have the final word. I never planned on having an affair, let alone with his boss. It wasn't some calculated plan. It started with a casual conversation at another one of those firm events. This time, my husband was late, leaving me awkwardly alone near the bar with a glass of red wine. His boss approached and recognized me. He asked how I was doing, made small talk. He didn't treat me like I was invisible. He actually listened. We spoke about books, about life outside of work. I found out he liked to hike and travel to national parks on weekends. He was older than my husband, but there was an energy in him that felt fresh, vibrant. At some point, he asked if everything was okay with me. I hesitated, not wanting to air my marriage's dirty laundry. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "I'm just a little tired." He gave me a look that suggested he saw right through the mask, but he didn't push. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the conversation. For so long, I'd been starved of genuine connection, starved of someone looking me in the eyes and seeing me, not just seeing a reflection of what they wanted. I told myself it was harmless, just a refreshing moment in an otherwise stagnant life. But then I found myself anticipating the next firm event, the next chance to talk to him. We chatted occasionally, short, polite interactions that felt like small flickers of light in my otherwise shadowed routine. My husband was oblivious, more focused on impressing his boss than noticing the growing tension or interest between us. One evening, we found ourselves alone outside the venue after another corporate dinner. I was waiting for my husband, who'd stumbled off after a disagreement, and his boss approached me again, a concerned look on his face. We talked about the night sky, about how the city lights made it hard to see the stars clearly, about how we both missed quiet places where you could hear your own thoughts. He asked me if I liked the hustle of the city or if I preferred something simpler. I confessed I always dreamed of a small house in the countryside, maybe a garden, a dog running around, space to breathe without the claustrophobia of so many tall buildings. He listened intently, nodding, actually asking follow-up questions. By the time my husband finally appeared, red-faced from too many whiskeys, I felt an ache in my chest as we said goodnight. It was a slow ache of longing, for conversation, for recognition, for the simple kindness of being heard. Over the next few months, those conversations became more frequent. He'd see me across the room, give me a subtle nod or a warm smile, and I'd feel my heart flutter. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself there was nothing wrong with enjoying the company of someone who respected me. But deep down, I felt the guilt. I knew I was dancing on a delicate line. I saw the irony too. My husband, always so keen to appear perfect in front of his boss, while I was gradually forging an emotional bond with the very man he wanted to impress. When I would lie in bed next to my husband at night, I felt a hollowness, like a massive gulf between us. We barely spoke anymore. He was never physically abusive, but his words cut deeper than he realized, and his indifference felt like slow poison. Every time I considered confronting him, telling him how I felt, the memory of his laughter and his scorn silenced me, so I kept my secrets and let them fester like a hidden wound. I remember the exact day everything changed. I was out grocery shopping, pushing a cart down the produce aisle, trying to remember if we needed extra lemons for a recipe. Out of nowhere, I spotted my husband's boss near the bakery section, browsing pastries. It was odd seeing him outside of the corporate environment, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. I felt a sudden burst of nervous excitement. He looked up, recognized me, and smiled. We ended up chatting near the display of fresh bread, talking about silly things like the best place in town for croissants. Then, in a moment of hesitation, he asked if I had time for coffee. My heart hammered in my chest. I looked down at my cart full of groceries, then back at him. I heard myself say yes. It was the first time we'd ever spent time together away from a work function or social event, and it felt dangerous in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. We went to a little cafe on the corner, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. It was one of my favorite spots, though I rarely indulged in it because my husband preferred the convenience of drive-through coffee. We found a small table by the window. He asked me about my life, my dreams. I told him haltingly at first about how I'd once wanted to open my own candle shop, how I'd pictured a little storefront with homemade products and a warm, welcoming vibe. He didn't laugh or dismiss it as a childish fantasy. Instead, he asked questions, wanted details, what scents I liked, how I got into candle making. Somewhere between his questions, I realized tears were pricking at the corners of my eyes. No one had cared about my passions like this in so long. He saw the tears and gently placed his hand over mine, a fleeting touch that felt more intimate than any kiss I'd shared with my husband in years. When I got home that evening, my husband was watching TV, barely acknowledging me except to grunt when I passed by. I felt a swirl of guilt and exhilaration in equal measure. That guilt only deepened when the coffee dates became a regular occurrence. We never planned it, but we kept running into each other, or he'd text me. He had got my number from the company contact list and asked if I was free. Each time, I knew I was crossing a boundary, but each time I'd say yes anyway. At first, we kept it strictly friendly. We talked about life, about regrets, about things we wished we could do differently. He mentioned how he'd never had children, how he wasn't sure if it was too late. I confessed that I'd once thought about kids, but felt I'd waited too long. There was a poignant understanding between us, like two people who recognized each other's loneliness and chose to stand in the same light for a little while. Eventually, the emotional bond became undeniable. It felt like my heart was waking up after a long hibernation. I loved the way he looked at me, not with pity, but with admiration and curiosity. Still, we hadn't crossed any physical lines yet, and I wondered if he was holding back out of respect, or if he simply didn't want to complicate things. I, on the other hand, felt an invisible thread pulling me toward him, even though I knew the ramification. The more my husband ignored me, the more I craved those secret moments of joy. The final push came after another argument at home. My husband had come back from work in a foul mood, complaining about the pressure he was under. He called me lazy for not cooking dinner early enough. The hatred in his eyes, the clipped tone, it all felt so out of proportion. I tried to stand up for myself, tried to explain I'd had a tough day too, that I wasn't feeling well. He scoffed, turned on the TV, and told me to just order takeout if it was too much trouble. The sense of worthlessness he instilled in me was suffocating. After he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, tears rolling down my cheeks. In a moment of weakness, or perhaps strength, I texted his boss, telling him I needed to talk, that I felt like I was losing my mind. I expected a polite reply that maybe he'd be free another time, but he immediately responded with an address of a quiet lounge, asking me to meet him there. I grabbed my coat and left, not caring if my husband noticed or not. That night, in the dim lighting of a cozy booth, I told him about the laugh, about my husband's condescending attitude, about my dreams of starting over and how they were always belittled. He listened, eyes full of compassion, and then, slowly, he took my hand. There was no hesitation this time, no guilt in his gaze. We leaned toward each other, and finally, our lips met in a tentative kiss that broke open the dam of emotions I'd been holding back for too long. It wasn't fireworks and grand sweeping music like in the movies. It was gentle, bittersweet, and tinged with the sorrow of everything that had led us there. But it was also empowering, like a sign that I wasn't condemned to be the woman my husband had confined me to be. I could almost hear my husband's laughter echoing in my head, mocking me, telling me I'd never have the courage to change. But there I was, pressed against the man who had been unknowingly fueling my desire for a new life. It felt like a betrayal, but also like a promise of something more. I didn't go home that night. I told him I couldn't bear to step back into that house. So we drove around aimlessly, talking about everything, from our favorite childhood memories to the mistakes we wished we could undo. He finally took me to his apartment, a modern space that felt oddly soothing with its clean lines and soft lighting. We ended up sharing a bottle of wine, sitting on his balcony, looking out at the city's skyline. The kiss became kisses, soft and searching. We ended up in his bed, where for the first time in years, I felt like someone saw me, completely saw me, and wanted me anyway. I was trembling with both fear and anticipation, but there was no cruelty or laughter at my expense, only warmth, understanding, and the slow unraveling of every knot in my soul. I felt alive in a way I hadn't since I was a young woman, full of possibilities and dreams. In the aftermath, as dawn crept through the blinds, I watched him sleep and wondered about the fallout. The consequences of this night would be enormous. I knew it would devastate my husband, or at least damage the pride he wore like armor. But wasn't it already devastating me to stay in that marriage? Weren't the cracks in that union so deep that this was just the final blow? I reasoned that I owed it to myself to feel something real, to remember what it felt like to be cherished. And though the guilt lingered at the edges of my consciousness, I also felt an empowering surge of defiance. He laughed when I said I wanted to start over. Well, here I was, taking the leap he'd never believed me capable of. Lying in another man's bed, a man who happened to be his superior, I felt both terror and triumph swirling in my chest. The next morning, I slipped away quietly, leaving a small note for his boss, thanking him, but not sure if I was thanking him for the night or for seeing me as a person. My husband was gone to work by the time I reached home, so I had a brief moment to gather some clothes, breathe in the stale scent of our loveless house, and contemplate my next move. I knew I couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. Something had definitely shifted inside me. But how would I handle the confrontation that was sure to come? My phone buzzed. It was a message from his boss asking if I was okay, telling me he'd like to see me again. I stared at the screen, a mixture of relief and dread washing over me. I wanted to see him again, but I also recognized that every step forward was a step closer to destroying what was left of my marriage. Then again, maybe it had been destroyed long before this affair. Maybe the day he laughed at me, or even long before that, was the day the threads started unraveling. I thought about how many times I'd tried to save something that had never really been there. This affair wasn't about revenge, at least not entirely. It was about liberation from a cage I'd let myself be trapped in. And that thought filled me with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Later that day, I sat in my husband's office at home, sifting through paperwork for our mortgage and insurance policies. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I felt compelled to examine the logistics of leaving: bank statements, credit card debts, anything that tied me financially to him. I realized with a jolt that I was far more entangled than I'd realized. My name was on so many documents, but he controlled the funds. A wave of anxiety washed over me. Could I even afford to leave? Did I have the resources to stand on my own? I felt trapped again, the euphoria of the night before fading under the harsh reality of finances and obligations. Still, as I looked at the pages, I noticed something interesting. He had a significant salary, far more than he'd ever let on. Where was all that money going? The statements were vague, but I sensed that he'd been building a life separate from me in some ways. Secret accounts, private investments, maybe. If that were the case, it meant he was planning for a future that might not include me. The bitterness of that thought made my decision clearer. That evening, I confronted him with a quiet defiance I didn't know I possessed. I asked him about the accounts I'd seen. He played dumb at first, then waved his hand dismissively. "It's just work stuff," he said, avoiding my eyes. I pressed, and his temper flared. He accused me of snooping, of not trusting him, of invading his privacy. I realized how warped our dynamic had become. He was the one who'd systematically dismissed my every aspiration, yet he had the nerve to talk about trust. We ended up in a shouting match, and though I was trembling inside, I refused to back down. Finally, he growled something about how I wouldn't understand the complexities of his finances, how I should be grateful he was handling everything. The nerve of him to act as though he was doing me a favor by keeping secrets. I stared at him, tears burning my eyes, but this time I let them fall. I wanted him to see how much he was hurting me. Instead, he turned away in exasperation, slamming the door to the study behind him. I stood there, my chest heaving, and thought about how I was already half out of this marriage in my heart. That night, he slept in the guest room. I sat up in our bed, scrolling through my phone, rereading the messages I'd exchanged with his boss. It hit me how twisted the situation was. His boss was, in many ways, the key to my freedom. But how could I rely on someone else when I needed to find my own strength? My stomach churned with a cocktail of hope and dread. Yet in those messages, I found a small spark of belonging. He wrote things like, "You deserve happiness," and "I want you to see your worth." Those were words my husband had never spoken to me, not once in all our years together. I fell asleep clutching the phone, dreaming of a life where I could finally breathe. In the days that followed, I secretly met with a lawyer. The idea terrified me, but I needed to know where I stood. She explained that given the length of the marriage, I had certain rights, but also that the situation could get complicated if he chose to fight me. My husband was influential at his firm, well-liked in the community, and adept at manipulating appearances. I left her office feeling the weight of what lay ahead. My mind drifted to the memory of him laughing at me, that smug grin etched into my psyche. If he'd found out what I was planning, I knew he'd use every advantage to keep me from getting a fair settlement. But then I reminded myself that I was no longer that timid woman who needed his approval. I was forging a path, no matter how daunting. Meanwhile, my emotional connection with his boss deepened. It wasn't just about stolen kisses anymore. We talked at length about what we both wanted in life, about the prospect of building something real once the dust settled. He opened up about regrets he had, a failed engagement years ago, his own insecurities about relationships. It struck me how easily we shared our vulnerabilities, how we felt safe enough to show each other the wounds we carried. I was torn between the thrill of this new love and the horror of the betrayal it represented. I knew people would judge me harshly if the truth came out, but at the same time, I'd been judged in my marriage for being too needy, too emotional, too everything. So perhaps I'd rather be judged for finally reaching for something that might make me happy than remain caged by someone who belittled my every dream. One afternoon, as I was packing up a few sentimental items, photographs of my late parents, a small jewelry box that was my grandmother's, I heard the front door slam. My husband stormed in, face twisted in rage. He'd found one of my candle prototypes in the study, discovered my business plan scrawled in a notebook. He hurled the notebook at me, demanding to know if I was planning to leave him and start this nonsense. He barked questions about where I'd gotten the money to invest in any of it. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. We ended up in a volatile argument, each accusing the other of betrayal in different forms. He spewed his usual venom that I was ungrateful, that I was a burden, that I had no idea how the real world worked. The hurt turned to fury inside me, a burning wave that broke through my timid facade. I shouted back that I wasn't stupid, that I knew he had hidden accounts, and that he was preparing for a future without me. I remember the look in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, followed by a sneer as if to say, "So what?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he told me that if I knew what was good for me, I'd drop this foolish idea of leaving him because he'd make sure I ended up with nothing. He left the house in a cloud of anger, and I stood there, tears streaming, the notebook scattered at my feet. Something in me hardened at that moment. I realized it was all or nothing. Either I let him bully me into staying, letting him control my life until I was old and filled with regrets, or I fight back, risk everything, and chase my own happiness. I wiped my tears, gathered the pages of my notebook, and stuffed them into a box. That evening, I quietly made arrangements to stay at a friend's place. I was done playing house with a man who treated me like an obstacle instead of a partner. Days passed in a blur. I moved out some clothes and essentials under the guise of visiting a friend. He barely noticed, as he was caught up in his own corporate battles. Meanwhile, I was meeting secretly with my lawyer, finalizing details, figuring out a plan for the day I'd file for divorce. I felt a swirl of guilt for the secrets I was keeping, but then I reminded myself of all the secrets he'd kept, the lies, the hidden money, the emotional abuse. My guilt lessened with each revelation of his deceit. In quiet moments, I clung to the memory of being in his boss's arms, the warmth of his voice telling me I was worth more than what I'd been settling for. The thought of a future with him gave me courage, even if it was uncertain. I still didn't know how it would work, how the firm would react, how my husband would retaliate, or if his boss and I could truly make a life together. But the possibility of love and respect was enough to keep me going. Finally, the day came when I filed the divorce papers. I handed them to my lawyer with shaking hands, tears burning in my eyes. This was the ultimate step, the point of no return. I felt a mix of terror and liberation, like I was stepping off a cliff and hoping the wings I'd been building would actually let me fly. My husband found out later that same day when he was served at work. According to a friend who worked at the firm, he went pale, then red, then stormed out of the office. I braced myself for the backlash. Sure enough, that evening my phone exploded with calls and messages from him, from his mother, who never liked me anyway, and from mutual acquaintances. He left voicemails calling me a traitor, telling me I'd regret this, threatening to ruin me financially. I saved every one of them, planning to show them to my lawyer if necessary. A strange calm settled over me. His threats no longer terrified me the way they once did. I realized that once you decide to truly walk away, the power your abuser has diminishes with every step you take. Of course, the affair with his boss came to light soon after. My husband raged about it publicly, painting me as a homewrecker and a gold digger who'd seduced his unsuspecting superior for money and status. The story spread like wildfire through the firm. Some people sided with him, others looked at him with raised eyebrows, questioning whether the perfect husband image he'd cultivated was just a sham. Meanwhile, his boss, I hesitate to call him my lover in such a dramatic sense, but that's what he was, faced his own set of consequences. The board at the firm frowned on such entanglements. He offered to step down, or at least move to a different branch, to protect me from further scandal. But I told him I didn't want him sacrificing his career on my behalf. I was determined to stand on my own feet to prove I wasn't just leaping from one man's shadow to another. The legal battles were fierce. My husband tried to hide assets, claiming he had no real money to give me. My lawyer exposed his inconsistencies, revealing a pattern of dishonesty. The sense of betrayal cut deeper when I realized how much time and effort he'd spent undermining me financially. But each new revelation fueled my resolve. He had laughed at my aspirations, belittled my desire for a fresh start, and now he was frantic to keep me tethered to him by denying me the means to live independently. Yet, with the help of my lawyer, and ironically, with some supportive statements from his boss about the firm's financial structure, I began to see a small light at the end of the tunnel. The divorce was messy, but day by day, I inched closer to freedom. Emotionally, I was on a roller coaster. Some nights, I cried myself to sleep, missing the idea of stability I once thought I had. Other nights, I felt a surge of power, proud of myself for daring to break away. My husband's boss, the man who had inadvertently become my anchor, stood by me through it all, though he insisted I make decisions for myself without worrying about him. He said something that stuck with me. Your new life should be yours. If I fit into it, that's a bonus. It was a stark contrast to how my husband had always made everything revolve around his plans. I found it refreshing, if not a little terrifying, to be the one calling the shots for once. Still, the fear that I might be repeating old patterns haunted me. Was I really strong enough on my own, or was I just clinging to someone else's kindness? A turning point came when I found a small storefront for rent on the outskirts of town. It was tucked between a quaint bakery and a vintage bookstore. The space wasn't much, peeling paint, a leaky faucet in the back, but the rent was affordable. My mind raced with possibilities: a candle shop, a space for homemade soap and bath products, maybe a little corner for tea and conversation. It was my dream, and for the first time, it felt tangible. My lawyer advised me to wait until the settlement was finalized, but I couldn't resist inquiring about it. The landlord was an older woman who reminded me of my grandmother, with soft eyes and a gentle manner. She said she liked the idea of a candle shop. She even offered to let me do some of the renovations myself to reduce the monthly rent. The next day, I rolled up my sleeves and started painting the walls a soft cream color. With each stroke, I felt a sense of ownership over my life that I'd never had before. I'll never forget the day my husband showed up at the storefront unannounced. I was kneeling on the floor, sorting supplies, covered in paint splatters. He barged in, his face a thundercloud of anger. "So this is what you left me for?" he spat, looking around with disdain. He had the nerve to scoff, call it a pathetic little hobby. He demanded to know if his boss was funding this. My hands shook, but I stood up, paintbrush in hand, and faced him. For once, I didn't flinch under his gaze. I told him calmly that it was none of his business how I was moving forward, that I was done explaining myself to him. He sneered, stepped closer, as though trying to intimidate me, but I didn't back down. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye and said, "You laughed when I told you I wanted to start over? Well, look at me now." He seemed taken aback by my defiance. For a moment, his eyes flickered with something like regret or fear. Then he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I stood there, heart pounding, but with a growing sense of triumph. I'd faced him down in my own space, on my own terms. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. Eventually, the divorce settled. The final agreement was more favorable to me than he'd ever wanted, thanks to documented evidence of his hidden assets and some timely interventions by my lawyer. I walked away with enough to invest in my shop and secure a modest place to live. My husband's boss, yes, the man who had changed everything for me, remained supportive, but he also kept his distance when I needed to handle things alone. He told me he'd be there if I wanted him, but he wouldn't overshadow me or overshadow what I was building. In a world where men like my ex-husband tried to dominate and control, his willingness to step back and let me find my own strength was a gift I never expected. Once the legal battles were behind me, I plunged into the work of making my little shop a reality. I spent long hours testing fragrances, designing labels, and painting shelves. I hired a young assistant, a college student who reminded me of myself at that age, bright eyed, full of dreams. She was enthusiastic about learning the craft of candle making. On weekends, I'd host small workshops where locals could learn to create their own scented candles. Word spread, and soon enough, I had a modest but loyal customer base. The first time I saw someone leave my shop with a bag of candles and a smile on their face, I almost cried from the sense of accomplishment. This was my creation, my stepping stone to a life on my own terms. My ex-husband tried in petty ways to sabotage me. He'd leave nasty online reviews claiming my products were subpar. He even spread rumors that I was using the store as a front for something illicit. None of it stuck. People in the neighborhood could see I was earnest, and his hostility came across as unhinged. His boss, meanwhile, kept a low profile at work, focusing on his projects and letting the gossip die down naturally. We still met for dinners, still found ourselves drawn to each other like moths to a flame. But there was a new layer of honesty in our conversations. We talked about the future, about whether or not we wanted to make a real go of it as a couple. He respected my need to stand on my own. He even teased me once, saying he admired how fiercely I'd fought for my independence and that I was more than capable of running my own life, with or without a man by my side. That statement made me admire him more. As the months rolled on, I felt a transformation within myself. I was no longer the timid wife who bowed her head and swallowed her tears. I had navigated a tumultuous divorce, stood up to my ex-husband's bullying, and found a source of strength in my own capabilities. Yes, I still wrestled with self-doubt on occasion. The echoes of his laughter sometimes haunted me when sales were slow or when a problem arose at the shop. But every time I succeeded in troubleshooting an issue, every time I saw genuine satisfaction on a customer's face, I felt a piece of the old me, lost for years, restored. My family, what little of it was left, had mixed reactions. My sister, who lived out of state, was proud of me for finally leaving him, but she also worried about the scandal of me getting involved with my ex's boss. My in-laws, of course, painted me as the villain, claiming I'd seduced him to climb the social ladder. I heard all sorts of rumors and whispered slanders, but at the end of the day, I knew my truth. I hadn't planned on any of this. I was just a woman who woke up one day and realized she was suffocating under someone else's scorn. If anything, my ex's laughter had become the catalyst for my rebirth. And though it was a dark, twisted spark, it ignited something in me that refused to die out. Eventually, the affair label began to fade. My ex's boss, let's call him Richard to make it easier, though I won't dwell on names, continued to see me, now openly. He was gentle but firm in his support, never undermining my autonomy. It was strange how easily we settled into a new normal. He'd come by the shop sometimes unannounced, bringing me lunch or just stopping in to say hi. We'd share a quick kiss behind the counter or a laugh over some silly trinket I'd found at the thrift store. There was a sweetness to it, a tenderness I'd never experienced in my marriage. Yet, we also had our share of conflicts navigating the complexity of his position, the lingering gossip, my ongoing emotional baggage from years of feeling useless. But we faced these issues with open communication, something I'd never had in my previous relationship. One evening, after we closed up the shop, Richard and I sat on the back steps, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of pink and orange. The air smelled of warm wax and lavender, remnants of the day's workshop. I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling content. He asked me if I ever regretted anything that had happened. Without hesitation, I told him I regretted the pain I caused, the deception, the betrayal of vows I once took seriously, but I didn't regret where it led me. Because in the end, I found the courage to live a life I chose for myself. And even though I knew people would talk, that they'd call me names, I had to remind myself that none of them lived inside my skin. None of them had endured the years of subtle but pervasive put-downs that eroded my self-worth. If I had to wear the scarlet letter of an affair to break free from that existence, So be it. In time, I ventured even further outside my comfort zone, expanding my shop, investing in new products. My ex husband faded into the background of my life, though occasionally he'd pop up like a bitter ghost trying to stir trouble. Each time, I handled it more confidently, reminding him and myself that he no longer had a hold on me. Every final piece of the legal settlement chipped away at the illusions of control he once wielded. The last time I spoke to him face to face was to finalize the sale of our old house. He stood in the empty living room, arms crossed, staring at me with a mix of anger and loss. There was no laughter anymore, just the hollow realization that he'd let his pride and cruelty drive me away. For a moment, I almost pitied him. But then I remembered the scorn in his voice, the nights I cried alone, the day he laughed in my face about my dreams. Any pity I felt was overshadowed by the relief of never having to compromise my worth again. After we signed the papers, he tried to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an attempt at last minute manipulation. I didn't wait to find out. I turned on my heel and walked out. That chapter was over, sealed by the quiet determination that had grown inside me. In the following months, business flourished. Locals found solace in my little shop, praising the handcrafted scents that seemed to reflect my own journey: lavender for peace, rose for hope, sandalwood for grounding. Sometimes I'd watch a customer inhale the fragrance of a candle I made, their eyes closing in contentment, and I'd feel a swell of gratitude that nearly brought tears to my eyes. The relationship with Richard also evolved. We had our share of challenges, disapproval from certain corners, the weight of our history, but we found a steady balance. We traveled together occasionally, exploring small towns where I could gather ideas for new candle lines, rummaging through antique shops for unique containers or inspiration. He encouraged me to start an online platform, which I did, and soon I had orders coming in from all over. There were nights we'd stay up late, packing boxes, laughing as we spilled packing peanuts everywhere. It felt like teamwork, like genuine partnership. Not once did he belittle my ambitions or laugh at my dreams. Instead, he celebrated them, reminding me constantly of how proud he was to see me thrive. Sometimes, though, I still heard that echo of derisive laughter in my mind, a phantom memory that crept in at my most vulnerable moments. But each time I pushed back, remembering how far I'd come. Life was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I seized and shaped with my own hands. I had started over, just as I'd declared I would. And ironically, I did it with the very man my ex husband had been trying so hard to impress. Part of me found it poetic, an inversion of the power dynamics he'd used against me, a twist in fate that showed me sometimes the smallest seeds of defiance can grow into the biggest life altering changes. When I look back at that day at the table in our old dining room where he sat reading the paper and I quietly said, "I want to start over," I can't help but smile at the memory of his scornful laughter. It was the push I needed, the final straw that broke the cage of my complacency. If he hadn't laughed, maybe I would have tried to keep the peace a little longer, kept shrinking myself to fit the small space he allowed me. But his dismissiveness lit a fire in my soul, and that fire led me to everything I have now: a shop of my own, a life of my own, and a relationship with a man who sees and respects me. And while I can't condone the pain our affair caused, I also can't deny that it was the catalyst for my emancipation from a life that was slowly killing my spirit. I suppose that's the bittersweetness of it all. Sometimes we have to tear everything apart before we can rebuild. And rebuild I did, with passion, with tears, with trembling hands at first, but with a growing strength that nobody could laugh away. I found my voice again, in the gentle glow of candle flames, in the supportive words of a man who treated me like an equal, and in the defiance that told me I was worth far more than being someone's punchline. Maybe the rest of the world can judge me however they want, but I know my truth, and I live it every single day I unlock my shop door in the morning. Every single night I close my eyes next to someone who respects me, and every single time I remember how far I've come from that woman who once cowered at the sound of her husband's mocking laughter. It's been a journey of heartbreak, betrayal, and redemption. And in the end, I did start over. I didn't need his permission, and I definitely didn't need his approval. I found a path carved by my own determination, not by the limitations he set. If I could go back in time and tell my younger self one thing, it would be this. Don't be afraid of the laughter. Sometimes it's the signal that you're on the brink of something extraordinary. And that's the story of how I walked away from a life that stifled me into one filled with possibility, all because he laughed when I said I wanted to start over. And so I did, on my own terms, with my own convictions, and yes, with his boss by my side, offering me the kindness and respect I'd long been denied. A quiet, resolute triumph rising from the ashes of someone else's scorn.